big deal, particularly if you're someone from Cuba in the time period in which she lived. The fact that you would get admitted to a school in England is pretty preposterous. Okay? She's an award-winning playwright and novelist, in addition to being a critical scholar. She taught Spanish for her academic career. Initially, she started the first Third World Studies program, so it's like an area studies program that looks at the effects of colonialism and development on developing nations. And she was the chair of African and Afro-American Studies at Stanford. Okay, so why is Wynter not more common? Okay, well, just take like 30 seconds and try and read this. Okay, and I think you'll see why. This is one sentence, by the way. She doesn't mess around. Okay, she has no desire to make her writing easily accessible or open to a broad audience. Okay, so this is not like a cherry pick the hardest Wynter sentence in the history of the world. This is like the first paragraph of an article. Okay, so we're going to talk about two secondary source works, two articles written by other people about Wynter. Okay, and I would highly encourage you, at least initially, if you want to research this, that's where you should start. Okay, because Wynter's articles themselves are very difficult to understand and use a lot of terminology that you're probably not going to be familiar with. Okay, so I would say it's great if you want to tackle Wynter, but I would start with secondary sources. And I think the fact that a lot of the writing is so difficult is sort of why this isn't a more common author. Okay, so before we talk about Wynter specifically, I just want to go over some background in post-structuralism. Okay, so post-structuralism generally is believed to be a branch of postmodernism. Okay, so modernism is the idea that there are grand narratives or master narratives that explain society. So Marxism is a modernist theory. Okay, what do Marxists think drive history? Class struggle. Okay, so everything that happens can be explained by the story of class struggle. Okay, postmodernists don't believe in meta-narrative. Okay, they say there is no one story that explains everything. Post-structuralists are a sub-branch of postmodernism, and they think, okay, that primarily the important thing for activists, politicians, theorists to do is look at language, okay, and the way language works, and the way language is deployed for political purposes. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about that's a key concept in post-structuralism is totalizing, or totalization. Okay, totalizing is pretty simple. It says there's only one thing. Okay, so Afro-pessimism is very totalizing. What's the one thing according to Afro-pessimists? Okay, apparently you all really need this lecture. Anti-blackness, okay? According to Wilderson, there's not other forms of racism experienced by quote-unquote junior partners. There's only one thing, okay? Traditional orthodox Marxists think the only thing that matters is the economy, okay? So there's like an old diagram of the base, which is the economy, and the superstructure, which is everything else. And according to Marxists, the economy determines everything else. Okay, so a totalizing system is a system that says there's just one thing that's important. Okay, closely related to that is the idea of a binary. Okay, and it may seem odd to be like, well, if totalization is one thing, why is a binary which says there are two things related to it? Okay, well, basically what binaries say is that there are two things, but they are arranged in a hierarchy. Okay, and one is more important than the other. So base superstructure is a hierarchy. Okay, a patriarchal hierarchy would be men at the top, women at the bottom. Okay, so binaries are the idea that there are two things, and those things are implicitly set up in a hierarchy. A project, according to post-structuralism, is a goal that you're working towards. Okay, so you could have a project like in school, like I'm going to complete this essay. You could have a project in your life, like I want to get admitted to X college. Okay, but the key thing about a project is it is not yet finished. Okay, so a lot of people talk about white supremacy as a project. What they mean is that the goal of some people is to establish white dominance. Okay, has that goal been achieved? Well, according to post-structuralists, they would say no, there is not a total and complete system of white dominance. There are places where that is being resisted. Okay, so project is a key idea because a lot of these K arguments like pessimism, settler colonialism, they don't acknowledge that there could be resistance or contingency. Okay, sociogenic means produced by society or societal forces. Okay, so according to Afro-pessimists, is anti-blackness created by society? No. No. Where does anti-blackness come from? Well, the middle passage creates a libidinal investment in anti-blackness. Okay, so libidinal economy is the idea that your brain works like a machine. Pressure builds up, and eventually that pressure does something. So you have latent anti-black impulses. Eventually they build up to the point where you act in an anti-black fashion. Okay, Sociogeny says the opposite. It says there is nothing outside of society or culture, okay? That everything we know, interact with, and experience is influenced by society, okay? So sociogeny is often put in opposition to ontology, okay? Which ontology says things are fixed. There are structures that cannot be changed, okay? Ontogeny, okay, remember post-structuralists love playing with language, so ontogeny is the middle ground between sociogeny and ontology. So it says society influences things that can become temporarily fixed. Okay, so you can think of that as like the permutation between sociogeny and ontology. Okay, so these are just kind of like basic terms, and then we're going to use those moving forward. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is mapping. Okay, and what I mean by mapping is not necessarily like drawing a picture, although that could be what it is. Okay, but mapping is often used by post-structuralists to respond to or to explain the way a thinker or theory, okay, discloses itself to the terrain. Like, what are we talking about? Okay, so you can map geography. You can say this is where the US-Mexico border is. You can map human geography. You can say this is where one cultural group of people exists and where a different cultural group of people exist. Okay, but you can also map ideas. Okay, you can say, according to neoliberalism, this is where there are free markets and this is where there are not free markets. Okay, those aren't physical things that you go and point to, like, look, a free market. Okay, but it's an idea that exists. Okay, so mapping is a really important concept for a lot of critical theory. Okay, so I want to talk about what are we mapping? What are we doing in debate when we read these arguments? Okay, the first kind of post-structural idea is the map is not the territory, okay, which is like an expression from the 17th century. And so what that means is that a map is a heuristic, okay? It's a way to reduce complexity to cope with the amount of information that exists, okay? So like a map of America can exist on one page. In order to get it on one page, you have to eliminate a lot of things by making the picture smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay, so the map is not the territory, is the idea that the way we represent people, places, ideas mentally when we map them, okay, that implicitly in that process there are inaccuracies. Okay, so like complexity theory is very big on this point. It says you can't possibly know all of the things that are going on in order to create an accurate map. Okay, part two of that is that perception is not passive. Okay, so a lot of people have this idea like you see something is just you receiving visual information in a one-way exchange. Okay, what post-structuralists would say is that the idea that the observer is not influencing what is being observed is false. Okay, so does anybody know what the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is? What's that?
Essentially, there's a limit to the amount of...
Can you talk louder?
So there's, within a system, there's a maximum limit to the amount of information you can know about it, and that an observer has an influence on that within.
Yeah, okay, so the way I saw Neil deGrasse Tyson explain this in a video is like, if I shine a flashlight on you, you might go like this, because it's like bright. Okay, but when you get down into like subatomic particles, the mere act of focusing light on something is enough to alter the trajectory of an electron. So it is impossible to see the electron without also influencing what the electron will do. Okay, that's a really like odd way to think about it, but that's essentially what you are doing when you perceive things. Okay, so like I go to BW3s with Clark to watch a Yankees game, okay, and there's a play at home plate. Clark is a rabid Yankees fan, okay, so he is not passively receiving information of was the Yankee baseball player safe or out. He's actively imposing his own conceptual schemas on it, okay, and so a Yankees fan is more likely to say that person was safe, okay, then maybe if they're playing the Red Sox, a Red Sox fan would be like, they're out, okay, so the whole idea behind perception not being passive is that what beliefs you have about the world influence the way you receive and process information, okay? Narrative versus facts, okay? When most 1ACs get up and start talking, they want you to believe that they're like a news reporter relaying a set of objective facts. Like fact one, the economy is going to decline. Fact two, immigration can fix it, okay? Even if it's a K team reading a 1AC, that's what they're trying to get you to believe. Like these are the facts about the world. The world is messed up. We should do something about that. Okay? Post-structuralists don't believe in facts. They believe in narrative. Okay? So most of you have probably heard the term narrative, like in an English class or something. The reason post-structuralists are using that word is to emphasize that all stories are constructed by an author. Okay? So the easiest way to understand this is eyewitness testimony in courtrooms. Okay? So most people kind of operate under the assumption that, like, if you see a car accident, 6 months later when you go to testify about it, you're just relaying the facts. Okay? But perception is not a passive exercise, okay? There have been tons of studies that prove that over time, your memories change, okay? So like if I have go out and like get into an argument with X person, and then later on I become really friends with them, my memory of that argument will moderate itself so that I no longer have negative beliefs. I won't view that as a negative or hostile interaction. Okay, so memory is not objective, and neither are facts. Okay, so everything should be considered a story. Okay, and stories are crafted by someone and for some purpose. Okay, so the key concept that really is different between Wynter and people who write about pessimism and settler colonialism is that Wynter thinks we can rewrite the story. Okay, we can change the way we understand the world. So instead of understanding the world through a lens of anti-blackness, or instead of being locked in a permanent dichotomy between settler colonists and indigeneity, okay, we can change the way that story operates because we are authors. We are constructing the world through language as we speak about it. Okay, so part of that is that from the map, okay, from the description, from the organization of the terrain, okay, we can make inferences about the map maker. Okay, so if perception is not passive, if you project things when you map the terrain or the world, then we can look at your map and infer things about you. Okay, so most of you have probably seen this in like a geography class or like hanging on the wall at a school somehow. Okay, does anybody know what is the big problem with this map of the globe? Yeah.
So, for example, Greenland is almost as big as North America, which
Yeah.
probably isn't the case.
Okay, so the perspective is all messed up. Okay, so like if you look, a bunch of things that look bigger than Africa on that map can all fit within Africa in reality. Okay, so what might we infer from maps that draw places in Europe really big and Africa really small? Yeah. Yeah, okay, there's some sort of perspective that's influencing the map maker. So it could be they're from the north, it could be they're Eurocentric, okay, it could be a variety of things. But the point is we can look at that map and we can make inferences about why it was drawn that way. Okay, now this is obviously a super simplistic example, but all I want to bring home is the idea that what we're going to be doing when we talk about Afro-pessimism and settler colonialism is we're going to, step one, figure out how they are mapping things, and then step two, we're going to object to the way they have mapped things. Okay, so once you kind of understand that process, it becomes a lot easier to understand what we're doing when we're reading a critique against these arguments. Okay, so let's talk about Afro-pessimism and mapping. Okay, so a key thing in Afro-pessimism is that history begins with the Middle Passage. Okay, so raise your hand if you've debated Afro-pessimism before. Okay, keep your hand up if you've ever heard a team mention a historical event prior to the Middle Passage. Exactly. Okay, so for Afro-pessimists, the world literally begins with the Middle Passage. Okay, now just like that map where Africa was distorted, okay, saying that out of 100,000 years of human history, only the most recent 500 matter, a lot of people find problematic. Okay, so the fact that Afro-pessimism starts history with the Middle Passage, that's the first chapter of their narrative, okay, is something that people like Wynter are going to contest. Okay, second, blackness is produced. Okay, so like the key phrase from Wilderson is, they went into the ships as Africans and came out as black. Okay, so what Wilderson is saying is that prior to the Middle Passage, there was no conception of black. Okay, that blackness was produced by the Middle Passage. It did not come into existence until then. Okay, so much like the other point that starting history with the Middle Passage could be problematic, a lot of people object to the idea that blackness is only beginning at the Middle Passage or only created in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, so according to this, are people in Africa who were not taken to the West as slaves black? No, okay, so that, a lot of people find that really problematic, okay? So in order to make that critique argument, you first need to understand how is Afro-pessimism explaining the world. Okay, Afro-pessimists refer to 1865 and the non-event of emancipation. Okay, what does that mean? What they mean is that the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation, okay, was a non-event. It's not, they don't literally mean like Baudrillard, the Gulf War didn't happen. Okay, but they mean that we've invested a bunch of historical significance in this date that's really meaningless. Okay, so for them, 1865 does not mark a major historical event or change. Okay, I think Wilderson uses the phrase, it's not a watershed, which is like a historical term for when things change dramatically. Okay, so for the Afro-pessimists, the historical record doesn't really change from the Middle Passage to now. Okay, even major events that other people think are important, like the end of the Civil War and emancipation, not relevant in their mapping of history. Okay? No progress. This is an argument that people have a lot of trouble wrapping their mind around, okay? What Afro-pessimists are not saying, literally everything in the world is exactly the same now as it was in the 17th century. That's not what no progress means. Okay? The key thing in understanding no progress is understanding the barometer. Okay? Like, how are we measuring whether or not progress has occurred? Okay, so most affirmatives, when they debate Afro-pessimism, get up and are like, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, here's a bunch of historical events that happened. Okay? The barometer they're using is change occurs when the state changes its laws. Okay, so the Afro-pessimist response is not literally no change has happened ever. It's that using state policy as the barometer by which we measure change is problematic. Okay, so for an Afro-pessimist who thinks that libidinal economy is the source of anti-blackness, okay, change, quote unquote, only occurs when we alter that ontological structure. Okay, so did the Civil Rights Act change libidinal economy? No, so that means there has been, quote, no progress. Okay, so they are not saying the world is exactly the same, and I would just be happy going back in time to the 1800s and living then. Okay, that's not the argument. The argument is, for a huge period of history, we've used the wrong measurement of whether or not there is progress. So there's like literally a part where Wilderson says, people respond to me with facts and history and theories from social science. That misses the point. Those are all bad ways of measuring the world or mapping change. Okay, that instead we need an ontological focus. Okay, and so things like sociology, which study the movement of people and how society organizes themselves, for Wilderson are not valuable, okay? Because if there's no grammar of suffering, if there's no way to interpret slavery, then it doesn't matter if you look at slavery historically because you don't have the language to interpret the events of history, okay? So if it is true that slave suffering cannot be spoken of in liberalism, we don't have the grammar, then the history of liberalism is quote-unquote irrelevant because it's all spoken in a language that necessarily obscures violence or abjection that occurs to black people. Do you have a question?
Yeah, if it's true that the way that Wilderson talks about it, progress is like.
Well, that's the whole end the world thing. For Wilderson, the only way quote-unquote progress could occur is to end the world because the world is structurally anti-black. So the barometer of change is world ending, not legislative accomplishment. Yeah.
Even if state policy can't affect the liberal economy, like why affect those instances? Like aren't they better than not having it?
Okay, well, so the analogy that I think best illustrates this is poker. Okay, so let's say you and I are playing a game of poker. Okay, and at the end of every hand, you end up with a royal flush, which is the best possible hand. Okay, if every hand I end up with 2-7, which is the worst possible hand, I am losing. Okay, if I improve to get 2-8, but I continue to lose to a royal flush, then no, incremental progress has not been achieved. Okay, so what Wilderson is saying is that when we do things like pass the Civil Rights Act, we're getting distracted from what would actually be progress. So to him and other Afro-pessimists, like incremental change is not a concept that registers. There can be no incremental change. You cannot incrementally approach being part of humanity. It's an either or, it's binary, 1 or 0. Either you're a part of humanity or you're not. And you cannot incrementally approach being a human, okay, according to Afro-pessimists, which is why the whole system has to be ended. So like that Omalade card that everyone reads about why extinction is bad. That card is not saying black people are suffering, so just extinct the whole planet. Okay, that's not the argument. The argument made is that certain people, if we conceptualize them as being outside of humanity, have already experienced extinction. It's a thumper, not an impact term. Okay, and so if you read that card, that's a much better way to explain it. The argument is not extinction doesn't matter because violence is happening to black people. It's saying a world in which anti-black violence is a structural principle is ethically not a world worth saving, is the argument that that card is making. Okay, time doesn't pass, it accumulates. Okay, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole on this one because people have like just a huge hard time trying to understand what this means. Okay, they're not saying literally like from 701 to 702 time has not passed. Okay, that's not the argument. What they're saying is that how we perceive time depends upon perspective. Okay, so linear time is the idea that like a linear impact, like every person you save is good. Linear time is the idea that time moves incrementally in fixed amounts. Okay, and so the idea that time doesn't pass, it accumulates, is basically just saying that your perspective influences how you see time. Okay, so like, if you've ever seen the movie Deep Blue Sea about the genetically enhanced super sharks, there's a part where LL Cool J explains Einstein, and he says, put your hand on a hot stove, and a second can feel like an hour. Get your hands on a hot woman, and 1 second can seem like, or an hour can seem like it passes in a second. Okay, so what he's saying is if you're enjoying what you're doing, time goes quickly. you're not enjoying what you're doing, time seems to slow down. Okay, that's like obviously not what Einstein is literally saying, but it's an easy way to understand the idea that time doesn't pass equally for everyone. Okay, so I'm sure some of you had a fight with like a friend or a significant other. The next day, you're like, I'm fine now, and the other person is still angry. Okay, I don't literally mean time for you has passed differently, like the other person did not experience 12 hours of change, but their perception of time is different because for them, time has not passed enough that they're no longer upset. Okay, so when Afro-pessimists say time doesn't pass, it accumulates, what they mean is that from 1865 till now, anti-black violence has not changed. Okay, so there hasn't been time-based progress. Okay, but anti-black violence has accumulated. Okay, structures that are anti-black have built themselves up over that amount of time. Okay, spectacular versus quotidian violence. Okay, so this is the argument that Hartman makes in Scenes of Subjection. Okay, so her argument is that traditional studies of slavery focus on the spectacular violence of the plantation. Okay, so a lot of books about slave history are focused on events like when a lynching occurred or why a slave was whipped. Okay, and what Hartman's point is that the terror of the plantation was not the fact that you could be whipped, or not the fact that you are getting whipped, it's that you knew at any moment you could be whipped. Okay, so violence is not a spectacular event that occurs infrequently. It's quotidian. It happens every day. You are terrorized by the potential of violence. Okay, so like an argument IR scholars make a lot now is that in countries where we engage in drone warfare, the buzzing noise that drones make is basically quotidian violence. That people hear that and they're instantly terrorized, even if they are not being targeted by the drone. Okay, that's the same argument Hartman is making. Okay, so for her, it doesn't make sense to focus on the actual outbursts of violence. You need to focus on the social structure that allows a group of people to be constantly terrorized. Okay, last one, or central organizing theme, okay? So all of these ways, these different things that we talked about, they're looking at different things, but the theme that unites them is that they are mapping continuity. Okay, they are mapping how things stay the same. Okay, so the non-event of emancipation says 1865 didn't change anything. The quotidian nature of violence says it doesn't matter whether you're being whipped or not, you're still being terrorized. Okay, so these all seem like different arguments, but what Wynter would say is that the universal theme in all of them is that our approach to mapping the world is looking for continuity, for looking for sameness, okay, to try and prove that history has not changed. So one of the big things we're going to talk about is what becomes problematic when that's what you're focused on, when you're focused on mapping continuity. Okay, let's talk about settler colonial mapping. A little bit different, but there's going to be kind of a similar universal theme. Okay, so for settler colonial theorists, settlerism is a defining paradigm that exists globally. Okay, so settlerism is not a particular thing like the U.S. colonized the United States, whereas Britain colonized India. Okay, it's a paradigm. It's a way of approaching the world. It says we can understand and filter ideas through the lens of settler colonist or indigenous. Okay, related to that, the idea behind settler colonism is that you come to stay. Okay, so regular colonialism, like colonialism classic, if you will, okay, is like we send some people to your country in order to extract natural resources or human capital, okay, some sort of thing from the environment in that place. Okay, settler colonism works differently. It says you move there permanently and open up shop. Okay, so permanence is a way that settler colonial theories map continuity. Okay, related to that, settlerism is not an event. Okay, it's not something that happens. Okay, just like 1865 is a non-event. Okay, for settler colonial theorists, there's no event of colonialism. There's no beginning and ending. Okay, it's just a process that's diffused everywhere. Okay, so for settler colonial theorists, it doesn't matter that a certain area wasn't colonized until a certain date. The global paradigm at that time was settler colonialism. Okay, so the individual specifics should not matter according to theorists of settler colonialism. Related to that, settlerism is about land theft. Okay, that's the defining feature of it, is land is taken away. Okay, so traditional colonialism focused on like resource extraction. So like we want to get sugar cane from the Caribbean because in England it's like 40 degrees and raining 364 days of the year. Nothing grows. Okay, you can't produce sugar in England, but you need it to drink your tea and like toast to imperialism. Okay, so you have to have a colonial project to go and extract that resource from something else. Okay, and so critics of traditional colonialism, their critique was this is bad when you just extract all the natural resources out of a place. That's not an ethical thing to do. Okay, what settler colonists are saying is it's not ethical to go or move there in the first place. Okay, so they're taking a broader or like global view of what's happening instead of saying, oh, it would have been okay if you paid for the resource. That's not the point. It's not about the resource, it's about the presence. Okay, many of you have probably heard the word teleological in debates before. Does anybody know what that means, or telos? Yeah.
Like an end goal.
Yeah, okay, so telos is an endpoint. This is something that has become like a K buzzword in the last like couple of years to be like, you have an endpoint and our K doesn't. And it's like, it probably does. But settler colonialism is teleological in that it has an endpoint. The end goal of the project of settler colonialism is the elimination of indigenous people. Okay, so the goal is not to get sugar. The goal is to eliminate the population. That's the teleological endpoint of settler colonialism. So settler colonialism doesn't begin or end, but if it were to end, it could only end by the complete elimination of all indigeneity. Okay, so basically what they're trying to say with this is that because the project of settler colonialism has genocide as a goal, okay, that we can't say that there are differences between different types of settler colonialism, that they're united by the fact that the goal is always genocide, even though like the rate at which indigenous people are exterminated or the manner in which indigenous people are displaced from their land may be different. For settler colonial theorists, those differences don't matter. Okay, so an example of this, okay, Patrick Wolfe, a historian of Australia, captures this perspective well in his claim that the fundamental social divide is not the color line, which would be race. It's not ethnicity, minority status, or even class. The primary line is the one that distinguishes natives from settlers, that is, from everyone else. Only the native is not a settler. Only the native is truly local. Only the native will free the native. One is either native or not. Okay, so what are things in that like instantly jump out, okay? If you're either a native or a settler, okay? So if a Syrian refugee comes to the United States, what are they? They're a settler, okay? Does it seem somewhat problematic to lump Syrian refugee fleeing genocide in with Columbus? Yes, it should, okay? That's what totalizing is, okay? Totalizing says you are either this one thing or this other thing, okay? It eliminates nuances or contingent differences, okay? Another example, Candace, I have no idea how you pronounce that name, in dismissing Asian claims to belong in the United States, puts it this way: indigenous people are differentiated from settlers by their genealogical, familial relationship with specific land bases that are ancestors to them. One is either indigenous to a particular land base or one is not. Asian Americans are undeniably settlers in the U.S. because we cannot claim any genealogy to the land we occupy, no matter how many lifetimes Asian settlers work on the land or how many Asian immigrants have been killed through racist persecution and hate crimes, or how brutal the political or colonial regimes that occasioned Asians' exodus from their homeland. So that card literally says, doesn't matter if you're a refugee, doesn't matter if you experience colonial violence once you get into this country, if you weren't born here, okay, you are in the category of settler. Do you have a question? Okay, so what's obviously problematic about this, okay? The quote-unquote indigenous people in America, where did they come from? Okay, Asia. How did they get here? Thousands of years ago, the Bering Strait had a land bridge, okay? So essentially this author is saying, if you come now, you are a genocidal settler. But if your ancestors came 1,000 years ago, that's a stupid date, like 20,000 years ago, okay, then you're fine, okay? But it says it doesn't matter how many generations are here, you can never be a native. Well, the other people are natives because they were here for a bunch of generations. Does that make sense? So this fundamental logic of deciding who is and is not a settler can't be coherent because of its totalizing claim. It's kind of the idea. Okay, so how could we map things differently? Okay, so this is from the article that I'm talking about, of the Sylvia Wynter article. It says, much has changed since Columbus's initial voyage. While this may seem far too obvious or even trite to say, it is nonetheless a point that is often forgotten or disavowed by those Wynter describes as falling on either side of the dualism of celebrants and dissidents of the event of 1492. Okay, so let's unpack that. First of all, dualism. What word does that sound like that we were talking about earlier? Binary. Okay, so either you are a celebrant of Columbus, there's not really a lot of those anymore, okay, or you are a dissident. You think Columbus was a bad guy. Okay, her point is that that dualism is problematic. Okay, that the project of colonialism that involved Columbus, okay, had both positive and negative effects, and that to totalize them, okay, to say that all the effects were exclusively negative is equally problematic from celebrating Columbus. Okay, it says celebrants see in the Columbian Exchange only a glorious achievement, which dissidents see and only an unending disaster. Paradoxically, though, focused on the consequences of 1492, Both celebrants and dissidents presume that the exchange did not irrevocably change the lives and futures of everyone concerned. Okay, so what is that saying? It's saying first, focusing on just the positive or negatives of Columbian exchange largely misses the point. Okay, because both people are acting as if the Columbian exchange, Columbus like Columbus, not like Columbia like the country, that exchange fundamentally altered the world. And if you're a dissident, if you're a critic of colonialism, you can't acknowledge that fact, okay? Because you have to say the world was fine pre-Columbus. Obviously, if you're a celebrant of Columbus, you have to say the same thing. Okay, it goes on. This is in part due to the disconnected, or as Wynter puts it, particularistic sense of the we that both celebrants and dissidents recognize themselves as belonging to. Each particularistic we is racialized, ethnicized, and increasingly nationalized. Okay, celebrants in the US continue to imagine that a nation as a simple extension of European or white society, while dissidents imagine native societies as if the category of native was not, in itself, born from a colonizing desire for power and the strategic need to foster hierarchical difference. Okay, what is that saying? What it's saying is that the very category of native didn't exist prior to colonialism. Can anybody explain why that was? Like, I live in the US and I don't know that Europe exists. Could I have any conception of a colonizer? If you don't know that other land exists, would you think of yourself as a native? No, that just doesn't make any sense. You have to have these concepts. Okay, so essentially what this is saying is that settler colonialism takes as given the parts of modernity that it needs in order to make sense and objects to the other parts. Okay, and so what this is saying is that that's problematic. Okay, that you can't just selectively pick which bits of history fit your theory. Okay, and that's what totalizing theories do, is they selectively read history. So there's a concept in psychology called selection bias. What that basically means is, like, if you're a conservative, when you see news stories that argue against your worldview, you don't click on them. Okay? You click on the ones that are like, new terror attack coming because of immigrants. You're like, that sounds like something I'd like, and you click on it. Okay, so what this part is essentially saying is that totalizing theories rely on selection bias in order to shape history, to map it in a particular way that supports their foregone conclusion, okay, that the dynamic between settler and colonist is problematic. Okay, so how do we map things differently? If mapping continuity is the problem, we need to map discontinuity, okay? We need to have a version of history, a version of looking at the world that doesn't pay attention to why things stay the same, that pays attention to how and why things change. Okay? It's kind of facially obvious that if you want to change the world, it should be more important that you understand how and why the world changes than how and why the world may quote-unquote stay the same. Okay, so in explaining the alternative, it's really easy to explain why a discontinuity map is more productive for activists than just looking at whether or not things have actually changed. Okay, so what do we think about the Columbian exchange when we map discontinuity? Okay, the Columbian exchange was transversal. Okay, transversal means that there's a series of intersecting lines. Those lines are not necessarily equal. The point is not to say they're all the same. The point is to look at places in which they intersect. So, was colonialism balanced in that Europeans exchanged equally with the colonized? Obviously not. Okay, Europeans took way more, killed way more, etc., etc. Does that mean colonialism was exclusively a one-way system of domination? No. Okay, so like, for example, when you think of a potato, what do you think of? What culture? Irish. Okay, is the potato native to England? No. Where did it come from? Okay, it comes from South America. Okay, so colonialism is a two-way process. I don't literally mean Irish people and indigenous people in Latin America sat at a table and were like, we'll give you 3 genocides if you give us the potato. Like, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what Wynter is saying. Okay, what Wynter is saying is that totalizing theories ignore the fact that all processes of cultural interaction are a two-way exchange. Okay, that some cultures may be getting the obvious bad end of it. Okay, but that doesn't mean that the person or culture doing the violence is an unchallengeable monolith. Okay, well, a good example of this is there was like a huge debate recently where there was like an Asian food truck in Oakland, and a bunch of people protested them for cultural appropriation. They're like, you are using spicy Thai food, but you are not Thai. Okay, but it turns out spicy food is not Thai either. Does anybody know where all spicy food originates in? What's the motherland?
India.
No. China, Latin America, every quote-unquote spicy vegetable, okay, like jalapenos, peppers, etc., genetically can be proven to come from Latin America. So how did it get to Thailand, India, etc.? Cultural exchange, yeah.
So are there no instances of colonial violence in which the original, or in which the oppressors do not oppress before that? Like, has to be the first time.
What do you mean oppressed before that?
Or, you know, since colonialism always goes two ways, you're saying like the story of colonial violence, you know, like go the other way because, you know, like Irish potatoes.
Well, so it doesn't go one way or the other way. It intersects. Okay, that's the point of transversal, is that you can't look at like who got the benefits and who got the costs. We need to look at the ways in which cultural interactions produced a new world for everyone. Okay, so you, like a settler colonist theory would say, the thing that's important about white people coming to America is land theft. Okay, and what Wynter would say is that, well, you need to understand why were they doing that? Why did they want the land? Okay, so for example, why did the first people go from England to America? They were being religiously persecuted. 10 minutes ago when I asked you if Syrian refugees were settler colonists, what did you say? You said no, because they're being religiously persecuted in their home country. Does anybody see a problem here? Okay, so if they're not settler colonists because religious persecution should justify mobility, why are white people settler colonists? Okay, this is what I mean. I don't think that's like the devastating, like you say that and then like drop the mic in the 2 Okay, but that's one example of how totalizing theories sort of break down when put under scrutiny. Okay, so the Columbian Exchange was transversal doesn't mean colonialism was good. Okay, that is not what we are saying. What we're saying is that we need to understand why the process of colonialism happened and how the subjects or objects, as an Afro-pessimist would say, of colonialism, okay, in fact influenced the New World Order, okay, even if it wasn't as much as the colonists, okay? This creates a new world, okay? Now, when people, like traditional historians say new world, okay, what they mean is that we discovered America, and America is a new world. That is obviously stupid. Like, we know there were people living there, we didn't quote-unquote discover. What Wynter means when she says a new world, okay, she means in the like Afro-pessimist Fanonian sense, that the world is a conceptual map, okay? So we have a new world as a result of the Columbian Exchange, okay? Why is the world different now than it was then, okay? Because we're now connected to other places that we thought were physically impossible. So like, why did no one sail in the direction of America prior to Columbus? Yeah, they literally thought they would fall off the map. Okay, so when Columbus proved that that wouldn't happen, I don't mean he created a new world in the sense of he discovered a previously unused landmass. I mean our entire way of thinking had to be reconceptualized from the ground up because we thought the Earth was flat. Okay, similarly like Copernicus, we thought that the sun revolved around the Earth. Okay, when we figure out that's not the case, we have to rethink all the beliefs based on that assumption. Okay, so how does this we change throughout history is influenced by the Columbian Exchange. Okay, so previously we were like, the we in that card, it was like the we is a particularist identity group. Okay, well, if you believe that God created the earth for white Europeans, and then you discover a new world in which there are people who are not white or European, it could change for the worse or for the better, but you have a new world. Your worldview has been altered. Something that you previously said definitionally does not exist is proven to exist. Okay? So when we map discontinuity, what we're looking at is events or processes that ushered in a new world, okay, that changed our consciousness or our way of thinking. Okay? And part of the Columbian Exchange and the part of the criticism of Afro-pessimism and settler colonial theorists is about whether or not we have a shared or differential humanity. Okay, so a shared humanity is like, you know, we all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. A differential humanity is like we think some people are less than human. Okay, so if we wanted to map discontinuity and we're studying shared versus differential humanity, what kind of events in the historical record would we look for? Well, let's just like think of some examples. The Great Depression. Did the Great Depression affect our shared or differential sense of humanity? Probably not. What about the UN Convention on Human Rights? Yes, okay, it literally says, like, we're all one people, everyone is entitled to these rights. Okay, so what mapping discontinuity means is looking at major history rupturing events, trying to understand what was at work there, and then if you want to change the world, applying those principles looking forward. Okay, so what are we doing when we're mapping discontinuity according to Wynter? Okay, we're talking about different conceptions of man. Okay, so for Wynter, man one is religion. Okay, man one means that like in the period, you know, from like 0 to like roughly the 1500s, okay, the defining principle that governed humanity was religion. So what are the Crusades about? Who's fighting?
The Christians.
Okay, you're sort of shaking my belief in the educational system. Yes, Christians and Muslims. So this is a confrontation not about civilizations. not about race, like Muslims were predominantly black then, but no one thought in those terms. Okay, it was about religion. That was what we were contesting. Okay, you were deemed not a part of humanity if you were not Christian. Okay, the Columbian Exchange expands the definition of humanity. Okay, after Columbus, when we have the first wave of colonialism in the New World, what are people trying to do? Okay, who pays for all of colonialism? Anybody know? Yeah, the church. Okay, why is the church sending people to the New World?
Get converts.
Yes. Okay, so Columbus, the reason he went on his expedition is because he was in debt. Okay, he thought that it would be a way to get out of debt. Okay, the Columbian Exchange expands the definition of humanity because we find out there are these people who aren't Christians, and we're like, well, we can have a civilizing mission. Let's go make them into Christians. Okay, so colonialism was not necessarily like get off your land. It was like convert to Christendom, and people were like, no. Okay, and then violence. Okay. This all relates to that phrase that was in the card earlier, propter no, okay, the us for whom the world exists, okay? So violence against non-Christians is justified. You can do anything you want because they don't count as a part of humanity. So for Wynter, particularized notions of we, or what our community is or should be, are problematic, okay? And the transition between different periods of history is about what that definition of shared humanity is happening. Okay, for Wynter, man too is bioscience. Okay, a bioethical or economic man. Okay, so what does bioscience mean? Well, we define who is a member of humanity biologically or through genetics. So does anybody know who Charles Murray is? Okay, Charles Murray wrote, was one of the writers of the book The Bell Curve, which attempted to scientifically prove that white people were like genetically smarter than other people. Okay, he's now the hero of the alt-right because we live in the man-too paradigm. In order to expunge or kick people out of the group of humanity, you have to have a scientific basis for it. Okay, economics is also a part of man-too. So what do conservatives think about minorities and immigrants specifically? They're lazy and weak. We can't let them into our country because they're going to overrun our social services. Okay, so economics and science have replaced religion. They're now the gatekeepers of who is included in the project of humanity. Okay? And so for Wynter, the project of mapping discontinuity is trying to figure out how do we transition to man 3? How do we move past religion and bioscience as the basis to a truly universal humanity? Like, what can we root our notion of humanity in if it can't be religion and can't be science? That will actually be universal, that will allow for all people to participate. Okay, and so Wynter's point is that man, okay, bioscience, religion, whatever it is, over-represents themselves as if the man was the human. Okay, so what do Afro-pessimists say? Humanity excludes the black. Black subjects are in a position of complete abjection. What Wynter says is that's not true. It's not that humanity excludes the slave, it's that Western man represents himself as if he was the extent of humanity. Okay, so remember, what is a project? It's something that's incomplete. The goal of Western man is to be viewed as the definition of humanity. And so one of the arguments that Wynter and other people make is that Afro-pessimists capitulate to that goal. They take it as a given that man too has successfully excluded black people from the category of humanity. Okay, so let's take a real quick detour here. Okay, so one of the things that we're talking about here is we're rejecting the dualism of dissidents and celebrants. Okay, that's what that card said. Okay, so one thing that post-structuralists talk about is decentering. Okay, so Batman and the Joker are both characters. Okay, Batman obviously represents good, the Joker represents bad. There's like 80 references in the movie to why they're the flip side of the same coin. Okay, what does that mean, the flip side of the same coin? They're both trying to do the same thing. They're both trying to reshape Gotham as they see fit. Okay, so while they are doing different things, one evil, one good, allegedly, okay, they still have the same end goal, the same telos, okay, to transform Gotham. Okay, so one thing post-structuralists point out is that a lot of critiques, like settler colonialism, for example, don't decenter the settler colonists. They just change their narrative from the role of savior or hero to the role of villain. Okay, and so what post-structuralists say is that the villain is oftentimes the more attractive character. Okay, so Batman, that movie was good because of the Joker. Okay, if you just delete all the scenes with the Joker, that movie is literally hot garbage. No one in that movie can act. The plot doesn't make any sense, obviously. Okay, so what post-structuralists say is that transforming from complete valorization of the West to complete demonization of the West misses the point. the point is not the West is good or evil. The point is it's problematic when the West is center, when the West is always what we're focusing on, when man is always overrepresented as the human. Okay, so the whole point of the post-structural process is that it's not enough to invert the hierarchy. Okay, so like feminists aren't saying we should abolish patriarchy and create matriarchy where women are at the top. That's not the point of their project. Okay, and so similarly, projects like settler colonialism, Afro-pessimism that have these alternatives like end the world, okay, people like Wynter would say the end effect of that is not to alter the binary, it's just to flip it. Okay, and that flipping can often be more problematic. Okay, so there's like a book called Genocide by the Oppressed that goes into how, throughout most of history, when revolutionary movements have occurred, they have then replicated the harms of the society they sought to overthrow. Okay, and so that's kind of the point here. Okay, so let's talk about mapping binaries. One difference is who has power. Okay, so like when you say patriarchy, what you're saying is men have power over women. Okay, when you say anti-blackness is the organizing principle of society, you're saying whites have power and blacks don't. Okay, you can also map similarity. Okay, both of these things make political differences based on solidified group differences. Okay, they say there's something different about these people, and that's the basis for what's actually happening. Okay, and that difference is hero and villain. One is good and the other one is bad. Okay, and so what we're trying to get at is that may be the case that there are similarities between these things. Okay, but remember, we're trying to map discontinuity. It's more important that we understand the differences, and that's what's going to be key to making these arguments. All right, I'm going to skip a couple things because we're running out of time here. No. Okay, so let's talk real quickly about Afro-pessimism specifically. Okay, so this person, if you don't know, is Lewis Gordon. The background on him, he's Afro-Jewish. He mixes existentialism, which is like a French philosophy about taking responsibility for the world, with post-structuralism and Caribbean studies. Okay, so Caribbean nations also experience the Middle Passage, but in a lot of different ways from us. The key thing about him, he's the guy who invented the concept of anti-blackness in a book in 1995. Okay, so prior to 1995, there was this thing called whiteness studies that basically said racism is about trying to be white. Okay, and so Gordon's point was even if you eliminated whiteness, if there was no white supremacy, there would be a residual anti-blackness. So people don't just want to be white. Okay, white people and other minorities don't want to be black. Is kind of his key insight here. Okay, so what does that Gordon card say that everyone reads, and how does this relate to Wynter? Okay, the first thing is it makes an argument about sociogeny. It says structures are produced by society and thus can be changed. Okay, so what do Afro-pessimists say? They say the world was one way, the Middle Passage happened, now the world is a different way and it can't be changed. So the first cross-sex question I would always ask someone reading Afro-pessimism is, if the Middle Passage could change the world, why can't events now change the world? Okay, and the answer to that is usually cricket noises. Okay, there is a part where Wilderson specifically addresses that, but basically no one can understand what he's saying in that paragraph, and a bunch of debate people have asked him this question at talks and whatnot, and he generally responds by going, "You must be a debater," and then moving on to the next question. Okay, there's literally an article in a journal by someone named Kua Hai that retells this exact event, that they went to a Wilderson conference, asked him this question, and then he just ignored them. Okay, so this is a crucial point that you should be attacking, and that's why that Gordon card is so good. Okay, because it doesn't really make sense that if the Middle Passage can shape the world, why can't other events reshape the world? Okay, he says that Afro-pessimists have a closed conception of what it means to be a human being. Okay, so one of the arguments that Wynter makes is that humanity should be reconceived as a verb rather than a noun. So you are a human being. Being is doing something, not a human existing. Okay, so Gordon's point is that closed conceptions of humanity, like Afro-pessimism, don't really make sense, because how did the system become closed? Someone closed it. Then why can't someone open it? Okay, and so it's really easy if you start kind of breaking down these pieces to understand why totalizing theories fail, because they understand a lot of things in the abstract, but have a really hard time with any particular. Okay, he says law-like generalizations and epistemology. So essentially the argument he's making is that anti-blackness is epistemological. It comes from how we understand the world, not ontological. It doesn't come from who or what you are. Okay, so what does that do? Well, first it refutes libidinal economy. There's no machine in your brain where pressure builds up and then anti-black violence happens. You interpret the world in a certain lens, and if you've been programmed by society to believe that racial minorities are inferior, then that will produce anti-black violence. So if anti-blackness is epistemological, not ontological, then we need to change the way we think rather than quote-unquote end the world or burn it down or whatever other way you want to use to explain the Afro-pessimist alternative. Okay, Another key concept is N, singular anti-black world versus the anti-black world. Okay, so Willerson doesn't literally mean in the like Rick and Morty multiverse sense, there are multiple worlds. What he means is that if worlds are conceptual maps, lots of people have different conceptual maps. A certain individual might have different conceptual maps. So there is an anti-black world. There is one world among many that is anti-black. Okay, and his point is that pessimists misunderstand this argument and transmute that into the anti-black world. There is a singular world, and that world is structurally anti-black. Okay, so this gets back to the definition of project. The goal of white supremacy is to create an anti-black world, but according to people like Gordon and Wynter, it has not yet been successful. Okay, so that's sort of what the N versus the thing is about. Okay, and that gets back to what we were just talking about, humanity being a verb rather than a noun. Okay, so if human beings are not a thing, if they're always in flux, Hugh Deleuze explanation, being versus becoming, then it doesn't make sense to say there is libidinal investment in anti-blackness or there is an anti-black world, because you can't even talk about the subjects who would exist in that world. All right, we're going to skip this and get to settler colonialism. Okay, so this person is Nandita Sharma. Okay, and she has at various points in her life been a different kind of immigrant. Okay, so she's been an immigrant to the U.S., she's been an immigrant to Canada, now she lives in Hawaii. Okay, which while Hawaii is part of the U.S., it is a very different colonial history. Like, didn't become a state until relatively recently. That card we read about Asians, that was about Hawaii. Remember, like the people who have been there for hundreds of years aren't native, even though the people who have been there for thousands of years came from the same place. And the other important thing is that she's a sociologist. So if you remember the quote earlier from Wilderson, she doesn't think sociology matters. Okay, so it's not surprising that someone who is a sociologist would disagree with those viewpoints. Okay, so what does Sharma say about settler colonialism? First, just like with anti-blackness, the colonist-colonized dichotomy is totalizing. Okay, so we talked about a couple of examples, like people fleeing religious persecution is probably the best one to give, but the point is that this binary doesn't actually account for all of the differences that can make up someone's identity. Okay, like what if you are partially indigenous? What if you're an indigenous person from a place in Canada where there was colonialism and you come to the US fleeing that? Are you now a settler in the United States? Okay, so asking questions like this, you can really quickly trip up another team into talking about this. Okay, so related to this, okay, the Columbian Exchange, according to Sharma, or the process that happened after Columbus, had both positive and negative effects. Okay, so we talked about navigability. The idea that you could now sail in that direction and not fall off the end of the earth radically changed the way people viewed the world. Okay, that there was more land that people could live in changed our conception of the world. Okay, that we were connected to these other people changed the way we conceived the world. Okay, so what Sharma says is she says the Columbian Exchange was Janus' face. Okay, Janus is like a mythological feature or figure who has two faces. Okay, so it's like colonialism, we have to acknowledge, is both good and bad. A good way to spot, like, is a theory totalizing, is do they acknowledge that there can be good and bad? Okay, so like even Marx, who's like a rabid anti-communist, admits that capitalism does improve people's lives, that it produces material well-being. He just says it's not equal, and therefore we need to equalize it. Okay? Sharma makes an argument about Fanon and violence. Okay, so a lot of teams that read pessimism are like, end the world. Okay? That comes from like a one-page quote from one of Fanon's books. But Fanon wrote a lot of other stuff. And most of the people who are critical of pessimism point out that they kind of ignore the rest of Fanon. Okay, and so one of the things Fanon says is that violence is not me punching you in the face. It's not a physical act that one person does. It's the process of cultural change and transformation. Okay, so when a culture changes, there is violence. Things have to be torn down and rebuilt. Okay, and so what Sharma says is that settler colonialism thinks of violence as only what is experienced by the indigenous. Okay, that it ignores that cultural change is inherently violent. So obviously, if we gave the land back, would that be a peaceful process? No, that would be a huge social transformation. Okay, so her point is that the solution to past acts of violence is not future, larger acts of violence. Okay? One of the things she points out is what we mentioned earlier. Indigeneity is not a natural or inevitable category. It's produced by colonialism. Okay, and so that quote we read before said, any particularist identity is necessarily exclusive. So the concept of indigeneity has to be exclusive. Okay, you have to define it somehow. Does anybody know in America, like if you want to prove you're a member of an indigenous tribe, what do you have to do? Yeah, you have to show blood quantum. Okay, you have to show that you have a certain amount, depending on the tribe and the place, of native blood that you can trace, back through ancestry. Does anybody know where did the blood quantum originate? Okay, originally, blood quantum was a tool of colonialism that said if we can prove you have any native blood, then you don't count as a person anymore. Okay, so Sharma's point is that settler colonialist theories take this really messed up concept of the blood quantum and assert that it's now liberatory, that we can use the blood quantum to determine who's a settler and who's an indigenous person. Okay? The fact that whether or not you're indigenous, whether or not you're a settler or colonist is determined by blood denies that those categories are socially constructed. Okay, so remember, post-structuralists are all about narrative. They believe the world is a story. So for them, the world is socially constructed. It's created by speaking and acting. Okay, if the identity is about blood, then it is not socially constructed. So if indigeneity is a blood-borne characteristic, can we ever move past the category of indigeneity? No, okay? So that's sort of the point here, is that if these identities are problematic, we shouldn't endorse a totalizing analytic like settler colonialism that makes it impossible to get past those categories. And lastly, that prevents universality, okay? That if something is determined by blood, it's always already oppositional, okay? So if you don't have that blood, you can't be included in that group, okay? It turns out if you map history and you look for groups who made the argument, if you don't have the right blood, you can't be a part of our group, the majority of them are not good, okay? So like Nazis, not good. KKK, generally bad. Like Northern Ireland, also bad. Like there's not been like a lot of progressive instances of where a blood quantum was good or productive for society. Okay? The main important point on this particular topic, okay, the argument that, as far as I'm concerned, absolutely destroys settler colonialism, is that settler colonialism confuses mobility with power. Okay, so what are migrants? They are mobile. They are people who are moving. Are the majority of people who want to migrate to the U.S. powerful? No, they're like Syrian refugees, people displaced by drug violence in Latin America, okay, people who've experienced domestic violence, people who live in poverty and want to improve their condition. They don't have power. Okay, so Sharma's point is that the critique of settler colonialism is bad for a lot of reasons, but the most important one for you all is that it's bad because it demonizes migration. It says you cannot leave your present circumstances. It doesn't matter if you're living in a country where there's genocide. It doesn't matter if you're living in a country where there's so much poverty you can't afford to feed your children. The act of you leaving those bad circumstances is in and of itself an act of indigenous violence. Okay, and so Sharma's like, that's really messed up. Okay, because indigenous people didn't just emerge from that land, they moved there pursuing a better life. So why was it okay for them to do that, but now we demonize migrants by saying they have to be a settler colonist? Okay? Related to this, settler colonialism creates a hierarchy of oppression. It says it doesn't matter that Syria is experiencing, almost a genocide, if not full-on ethnic cleansing. Okay? That doesn't mean that you can move. Okay? That's not enough because indigenous people have been so oppressed throughout history that we now must respect their land rights. Okay? So no other form of oppression can justify mobility in a settler colonial framework. Okay? Migration in a field of settler colonialism is understood as quote-unquote leaving one's home. Okay? Is everyone who is a migrant leaving from the place they were born?
No.
No. Most people have already been displaced. Okay? So like when people come from Colombia escaping drug violence, it's not necessarily the case that they lived in Colombia their entire life or that they experienced a peaceful journey along the way. Okay, so migration is not necessarily leaving a home. Okay, what about people who don't have a native land? Okay, like currently in Israel-Palestine, there's a huge dispute about whose land is that. Do you think a blood quantum is the solution to the Israeli-Palestine conflict? No, like not anywhere close to the solution. Okay, so it's impossible to understand the nations of place and home if you have this sort of blood quantum approach to the world. Okay, last one on that. The land itself becomes racialized. Okay, so if land is owned by a certain group of people with a blood quantum historical connection to it, then that land is by rights only possessible by those people. Okay, and so the idea of blood and soil comes from German. Okay, and nothing good comes from German. So Blut and Bodein, okay, is a Nazi slogan, blood and soil. Okay, so the Nazi project was to reclaim land that the Nazis had been pushed off of by colonists. Okay, now when you make this argument, are you literally saying indigenous people in the U.S. are Nazis? No, that's not what you're saying. What you're saying is that the totalizing rhetoric of settler colonialism ends up being so radical and deterministic that it dovetails, or the Venn diagram overlaps, okay, with actual Nazis. Okay, that should be problematic for someone who thinks they're, making a progressive claim. Okay, so real quick example. So anytime you read a K like this and you're like, you don't believe in universal humanity, that's bad, blah, 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 the app is going to be like, universal humanity is impossible. It can never exist. Okay, so what are some examples you can give about universal humanity? Okay, well, in the context of indigeneity, was there a group of people pre-Columbus who identified themselves as indigenous? No, right? Because they didn't know that there was another world. Okay, so indigeneity was a category initially applied to people who lived near the coast. Then we found out there was more people, and we expanded the category of indigeneity. Okay, the Aztecs who lived in Mexico viewed foreign colonizers the exact same way as they viewed other indigenous people in Mexico. They thought they were both foreigners. Okay, now all of those people refer to themselves as indigenous. So the very category that settler colonists say is important, indigenous, has been expanded over time to include more people. So if definitions can expand to include more people, that seems to support the idea that universal humanity could exist. Okay, the category of slave. One of the criticisms people make of Afro-pessimism is that Wilkerson and others don't acknowledge that there were distinct cultures, tribes, and ethnic groups in Africa. Okay, not all of whom are now considered black. Okay, so the category of slave was expanded. Okay, at certain points it included, like Irish indentured servants. At certain points it included people of Asian ancestry. Does anybody know, has anybody read Orlando Patterson, like the actual book that Social Death comes from? Not surprising. Okay, so Orlando Patterson, ironically, is a really conservative dude who doesn't think racism exists anymore. And when he wrote the book about social death, his point was that everyone, if you look at their history, can trace themselves back to slavery. So his point was not that black people uniquely experience social death. It was that the problem with the idea of slavery is that we restrict it only to black people. And if we looked at a broader definition, we could use slavery as a form of universal humanity. So literally the idea in Afro-pessimism of social death is an argument for universal humanity. Okay, last example, the Haitian Revolution. This example is good because a bunch of neg teams will read cards that's like, burn it down was the Haitian Revolution. Okay, it wasn't really. In the Haitian Revolution, there was two leaders, okay? First there was Toussaint and then there was Dessalines, okay? They had very different approaches. When France initially sent armies to sort of recolonize Haiti, in the first major battle, as they were approaching, they heard a bunch of chants and like murmuring, okay? And the officers informed them that these were primal war chants. And when they got closer, they saw that the former slaves were singing the French national anthem, okay? And the French soldiers then refused to fight. And so the point about this historical analogy, excuse me, is that the Haitians were using the principle of universal humanity, okay? The French Revolution ideas about universality, egalitarianism, liberty, they used those as weapons against the colonizers, okay? And so they expanded the definition of universal humanity. The soldiers of the colonizer refused to fight, okay? And so if you can point to a couple of examples of that when you explain things like the alternative, you're going to get a lot more credibility on the issue of is a universal humanity possible, okay? Like if in the midst of a war over colonialism, we can recognize shared humanity, or as Susan Buck-Morse says, universal humanity is visible at the edges. Okay, if we can see that there are the seeds of universal humanity, then we can tell a different story and sort of reshape society. Okay, sorry, that was a little bit over time, so we're going to end it there.